Okay, first I have to find the microphone. That's a good thing. I guess we saved the best for last, so to speak. And this is kind of dense, so I'm hoping we can get through it in a reasonable amount of time and not have to do it in two shots. And probably if I would stop yammering away here about it, we'd get to it, wouldn't we? At a glance, Chapter 24, the environment. And this is really rather important, not only for your personal real estate, but for your business real estate. There are a lot of laws, rules, regulations, and agencies that you need to be aware of for any type of environmental concern. Disposing of waste, disposing of any type of pollutant, and even for putting in certain equipment. So it's kind of a capstone to everything we've been talking about, and quite honestly, it's relatively new in business law as compared to some of the things that we've discussed, although there have been common law actions. And they are clear back into England centuries ago, where they were dealing with dirt and soot and odors and just unsanitary conditions. There were common laws that prevented some of this, that would have a neighbor be a nuisance, which was an unreasonable interference with land use or enjoyment. So pollution laws or environmental laws go back quite a ways, but they weren't as obvious and as many as we have now with all of the business going on. Of course, back 300 or 400 years ago, they also didn't have the industries we have that can pollute so tragically and really affect another person's real estate. So even today, we have, you can actually sue a neighbor for a nuisance. Let's see if I can think of an example. Let's say somebody puts a large hog farm operation next to you and pollutes your well. You can sue them for negligence, and they would have to redo your well, or they would have to remove the harm. This always has to be balanced against the harm versus the cost to correct. An example, let's say there's a open feedlot across from your house, and it draws flies, and there's a possibility that it could ruin your well, and overall it has devalued your property tremendously. You can actually sue them for a nuisance and probably not get them to move that feedlot unless it's proven to be a health hazard in general. But you could sue them for the amount of property devaluation that you have and have a fairly good chance of winning in court. So there are stipulations even for the personal citizen or the private citizen for somebody polluting or ruining the environment of your real estate. And we talked about negligence and strict liability with this. A lack of reasonable care to prevent is going to be negligence. And again, that word reasonable keeps popping up all over the place here. You have toxic torts, which I just talked about with the feedlot. And if there is strict liability, it doesn't require reasonable care. I mean, that's not in there. If there's strict liability concerning the environment or polluting the environment, in that case, the reasonable care is just not considered. Now, who controls all of this environmental laws, and what is the source of the environmental laws, I guess I'm trying to say? There's a lot of federal regulation, and there are regulatory agencies. There's the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, at the federal level. You also have that at each state level. There's the Department of Interior, the Department of Defense, Labor and Food and Drug. I guess that needs Labor Department. I think that needs a comma there. And there's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So there are many, many agencies that are looking at and trying to control pollution and the environment. And then again, as I mentioned, private parties can sue to enforce EPA or environmental regulations if the agency does not. So there's a lot of attention on the environment at this point in time. I think I'll put a question here. There's a lot to cover in this chapter, so there'll be several questions. So go check out the question, and we'll start talking about environmental impact statements. So here we're going to talk about in many cases, okay, in many projects, if it's a federal project or it uses federal funds or it's on federal land, and it's considered a major federal action, there has to be an impact statement written up on it. How is it going to impact the environment? What are the adverse effects or alternative actions that might be taken? What are the irreversible effects that might be generated out of this project to the environment? And this has to be thoroughly taken care of and can take up to a year, if not more, if there are complications. So every federal project has to go through this particular action. They also look at hazardous waste through the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And it's talking about solid hazardous waste. It needs to be labeled and packaged properly. You can't change the label. You need to be able to tell people what is in there so they're aware of it. They've also created something called the Superfund, which does information gathering on a large polluted site. The EPA responds to this for emergencies, and there's a trust fund developed to pay for the cleanup. And many times the government will pay for the cleanup, but they will try to investigate and find out who's responsible for the mass pollution and get them to pay for the recovery costs. And that brings you to a really interesting word or phrase. It's potentially responsible party. And there are like 4 elements to that. So there are 4 different parties who could be responsible and could be brought into an action to pay for the pollution. Number 1 is the person who generated the waste. 2, the person who transported the waste. So you could have, 2 different parties there, actually 2 different entities, who owned the site at the time that the waste was deposited, and who owns the site right now. So you've got 4 responsible parties that could be brought into the action. And if I'm not mistaken, there might be a super site outside of Lafayette, what used to be a landfill. It's across from what used to be Dunkin' Meters or the Produce surplus store. You'll see a large area that used to be a landfill. I believe at one time that was a Superfund area. So they do exist. I don't think we hear as much about Superfund cleanup anymore as we used to, because things have really become much more regulated, and there's many more watchdogs out there to protect the areas. How about another question? Oops, that's not good. That's from another one. Let's do a question here, and I'll move this over so I can remember. We'll meet back at air pollution and the Clean Air Act. So go to the question. I'll wait here for you. Are you back? Alrighty. We've got air pollution, which is the Clean Air Act. I believe that was in the 1974. I may be mistaken on the date, but it was in the 70s. There's mobile sources of air pollution, and there's stationary sources of air pollution. Your mobile sources, obviously, are automobiles and trucks and anything moving. And they're looking for an 80% reduction of air pollutants coming from automobiles and trucks by the year 2050. And that's being controlled by when the vehicles are being manufactured. Actually, they're probably also looking at the content of gasoline, if they can lower the amount of emissions coming from the gasoline, or they're even looking at different fuels that could be used in that. So stationary sources are really important area to look at. And the prevention for stationary sources falls to the state and local governments. EPA will come in if it's a federal or something that crosses state lines, an interstate issue. In general, the EPA has its rules and regulations, and the EPA's rules will supersede state rules if it's brought into question. So the regulation depends on the location. Very interesting and sometimes frustrating. There are certain locations that have low pollution, so their regulations have higher levels of allowed pollution than an area that already has a high level of pollution. Lafayette is what they call a containment area, which means their pollution has hit a level that will not allow some additional development for air pollution permits. Whereas if you come to Wake County, they don't have the level of pollution that Lafayette does, so there are more air pollution permits allowed in Wake County than in Tippecanoe County. It looks at hazardous air pollutants. There's over 200 substances, and right now, for a while, CO2 was not considered a pollutant. That's considered a greenhouse emissions, and it was not covered under the Air Pollution Act, and that's now changing. There's quite a battle going on with what those limits can be. And they look at controlling air pollution out of plants with what they call maximal achievable control technology, which means they use the latest and the greatest to achieve the maximum removal of the pollutants from the air. And then greenhouse gases were included in 2009, and those regulations are still in flux. CO2, they're really tightening down on right now, especially with gas or with coal-fired emissions. So that is something to really be watching. Then there's violations of the Clean Air Act. They can get pretty expensive. $25,000 a day, per day. An additional $5,000 for failing to keep the required records. That's per day. Then there's usually an overall fine or fee. Private citizens can sue also. And if you knowingly pollute the air in a facility that is being monitored, there are criminal penalties that are brought into the situation. So it is not something to be taken lightly. Let's do another question, and then we'll move on to water pollution and talk about the restrictions of water pollution. So I'll meet you there. So we covered air, now we'll cover water. And that's called the Clean Water Act. Imagine that. It was to make the water safer for swimming, to protect fish and wildlife, and to eliminate the discharge of pollutants into the water. There were times when rivers could actually catch fire from the pollutants in them. And so in the 70s, this all changed because we came up with the Water Pollution or Clean Water Act. So you don't have to have a permit for any type of pollutant discharge into the water, the watershed or the water stream. There's a national pollutant discharge elimination system that keeps track of the permits and what's being put into the water. There are point sources that are watched and monitored. You have to apply to discharge pollutants, and that application is renewable every 5 years. These point sources are monitored to make sure that they are complying with the permit they have. They now cover stormwater discharges, and many cities have had to revamp their sewage systems so that the storm water goes to a different area than what the discharge from the sewage goes to, and that's all monitored. They have to use not maximum achievable control technology, but the best available at the time. So it's not quite as stringent as the air. Existing sources use best practical. Again, it's not best available. We're looking at best practical for it to be modified for the system that it's going to go on, an older system. Wetlands are protected, and wetlands are very important for drainage, number one, and for filtration of water coming off of fields. So they're protected with the Water Pollution or the Clean Air Act. There are violations of the Clean Water Act, not quite as stringent, okay? Their fines can be between $10,000 and $25,000 daily. And intentional, again, pollution. If somebody just takes something and dumps it over the side of a bridge, and it's highly pollutant and it kills fish, there are criminal charges that can be brought to them, and they're required to clean it up and to reimburse for any loss of property, such as the fish or wildlife involved. There's also the Safe Drinking Act, and the EPA sets the maximum levels for pollutants. There's a that's kind of in flux. They are. I'm trying to think. There was a new, I think it was arsenic. The level of arsenic is being reevaluated for water, as I recall. So just because it has limits set now doesn't mean that those limits won't be reevaluated. This uses the best available control technology to make sure the water is safe, and water suppliers are required to send a statement about the quality of your water. For municipals, for even reservoirs, if water comes from there. This kind of puts people with a private well. They have to have their wells, or they should have their wells checked yearly to make sure nothing has seeped in that could be causing a pollutant to be in the water that they're drinking. If you live in the country, it's a big concern because of nitrates and because of cattle and livestock operations close by. And right now, there's no reporting of the medicines found in the water. That can be changing. They have actually checked water supplies to see how much medicine is being eliminated through the sewage system and goes back into the water system. It's also used sometimes to find out what the drug of choice is in a municipal. What shows up, what has the highest rate of showing up in the water. Then there's the Oil Pollution Act. Those responsible, must clean it up. Toxic chemicals, pesticides and herbicides are really becoming really important because they're everywhere, they're invasive. To be able to sell them, first of all, they have to be registered and they have to be certified, and used for certain applications. Even to apply them, you have to have certification anymore. It used to be a farmer could just go buy the herbicides and put them on themselves, and now they have to be certified to be able to do that, so they put them on properly. One of the big reasons for this is, number one, overspray into somebody else's property, and also because of the runoff from the fields. If you put too much on, too much gets ran off into the water system and can affect an entire population. Substances are considered harmful if they 1 in a million cancer risk. This is very, very serious in farming, because many of the farmers are handling these, and the cancer rate has went up tremendously just because of improperly handling of herbicides and pesticides for the farming community itself. Violations: you can't sell unregistered chemicals, and it can't be falsely labeled, and you cannot falsely advertise it. So it's a very big thing, because this affects the food supply. So this is really being watched, and there's more and more regulation coming out in this particular area. Toxic Substance Control Act. I told you they're all over the place. There's all kinds of acts. This is looking at asbestos and PCBs. And they require special labeling, limited use, and production quotas. And sometimes it's just absolutely prohibited. Asbestos is, you can't make that anymore. You can't use it anymore. PCBs have been banned. You can't use those. So the toxic substance, I think, area is probably going to grow more than anything, because we're using so many substances right now that we really don't know what in the future they may cause. So stay tuned for that one. Another question, and then this is our final lecture. And like I said, I think we left the best for last. Very dense, heavy with terminology here. Be aware that as a business you are liable for pollutants or any type of emissions. So have a good day, and I'll see you in class.